maybe in further occasions, I will be able to be there with all of them.
It's a marvelous experience.
Yeah, for sure. It has to be.
That's it. Oh, you're right. Okay, great. All right, I've got 1:30, and a chair's only job is to make things run on time. So we'll try to be efficient with that and get right into it. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Renfro. I am a former member of the faculty here at the Naval Academy, and I have to tell you that my favorite thing about the 2021 McMullen is that I'm not running it. I'm very much enjoying the symposium. I have the very great privilege of being the director of the National Museum of the United States Navy currently. We have an outstanding panel today entitled The Transformation of the U.S. Navy in the Late 19th Century. What I would like to do is introduce each of our panelists. I will introduce all three to begin with, and then we will take them in the order as printed on the program. So that will be Stephen first, followed by our one in-person panelist here, Andrew Blackley, and then finally Pedro Pinera Martinez will finish up. I'll ask each panelist to take about 20 minutes, and that should leave us some time at the end for questions and answers. So without further ado, our first panelist, Stephen Kinnaman, is a naval architect and marine engineer. During his career, he accumulated 45 years of experience in ship design, marine operations, offshore drilling, floating production, shipbuilding, and regulatory compliance. He is an alumnus of both the University of Michigan and Cambridge University. His professional services were performed on an international basis as a consultant to major oil companies, drilling contractors, engineering firms, and shipyards. Primarily based in Houston, his work has taken him to many locations throughout the world, including London, Aberdeen, Gutenberg, Rotterdam, St. John's, Rio de Janeiro, and Singapore. For many years, he pursued a second career as a naval historian, having published two books, Merrimack, the biography of a steam frigate in October 2018, and Captain Bullock, the life of James Dunwoody Bullock, naval agent of the Confederacy, in October 2013. He also has an article published by the U.S. Naval Institute, Inside the Alabama, in the summer of 1990, and has presented papers at the McMullen, the historical societies, and to many Civil War roundtables. Stephen Kinnaman and his wife, Maureen, currently reside in Chapel Hill, Texas. Andrew Blackley, sitting here to my right, comes to us from Chardon, Ohio, where he is a civil engineer, and he is also a city councilman. So I suppose it's the honorable Andrew Blackley, right?
I'll take it.
He has a Bachelor of Civil Engineering from Cleveland State University, a Master's in Business Administration from Boston University, and a Master's in Military History from Norwich, cum laude, in 2008. He's got several publications and conferences to his credit. He'll be presenting a paper today, Albert B. Niblack and the Formation of the Modern U.S. Navy, 1890 to 1917. And then finally, rounding out our program, coming to us all the way from Spain, Pedro Pinera Martinez is the secretary of the Spanish Association for Military History since 2016, and is a full-time pre-doctoral researcher at the General Gutierrez Mellado College in Madrid since 2019, where his PhD studies focus specifically on Spanish military history and historical international relations. He holds a bachelor's degree in history from the University of León, a master's degree in international relations and diplomacy, and a master's in peace, security, and defense. And he's also been graduated as a peacekeeping missions observer in the Spanish Army's War School and has a junior diploma in national defense from the Center for National Defense Studies of the Spanish Armed Forces. In his current investigation, he's analyzing the reports sent to Madrid by the Spanish military and naval attachés during the period 1844 to 1921. So with that, I will ask then Stephen to kick us off with his paper, Constructor Lenthal's Mahanian Moment, how much better it is to fight at the threshold than upon the hearthstone.
Okay, I'll start with sharing the screen. Okay, are we up and running?
Looks good.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
Okay, good day. I am Stephen Chapin-Kinnaman, and I am pleased to be at the symposium to present my paper, Constructor Lenthal's Mahanian Moment, how much better it is to fight at the threshold than upon the hearthstone. This paper is about a letter written on 17 March 1862. The American Civil War was then entering its second year. It was a letter that foreshadowed a paradigm shift of the Navy's means of exerting American sea power at the dawn of the ironclad era. It was also a statement by two Navy staff officers challenging what they perceived to be a retrograde realignment of U.S. Navy priorities. But despite its significance, this letter has rarely been accorded the attention it truly deserves. The letter was written by the Chief of the Bureau of Construction, Equipment, and Repairs, Constructor John Lenthal, and its Engineer-in-Chief, Benjamin Isherwood. It was addressed to the Secretary of the Navy, Gideon Welles. Both Lenthal and Isherwood were outstanding officers with good reputations, and Welles had now been Lincoln's Navy Secretary for a year. And what motivated them to write their letter? The Battle of Hampton Roads had just been fought a week before. The Navy's disastrous losses from the first day had been partially offset on the second day by the novel ironclad Monitor's plucky defense of the Union squadron. Such a difference a few hours can make. The news of Monitor's apparent success spread like wildfire. And what was their concern? That the U.S. Navy would build its future fleet of ironclads based solely on Monitors. Spurring them was the knowledge that Assistant Secretary of the Navy Gustavus Vasa Fox, a Monitor enthusiast, had witnessed the action at Hampton Roads and was keen to order more. Monitor fever was now sweeping the nation, and John Ericsson's lobby was pressing the Navy hard to build 6 of his improved version, the Passaic class. But were Monitors the right ironclad warships for the U.S. Navy? Yes, they were good solutions for harbor and river defense, yet with only 2 slow-firing guns in a single turret, they lacked hitting power and redundancy. Further, their signature low freeboards made them unseaworthy and incapable of sustaining ocean-going operations. And they could not provide a blue water offensive capability against the latest European ironclads. The U.S. Navy's foreign squadrons would be left toothless. Wrapping all of these concerns into a single metaphor, Lenthal and Isherwood's letter concluded by stating, "If ever assailed by a powerful maritime foe, we shall find it to our prosperity, if ready, how much better it is to fight at the threshold than upon the hearthstone." These words were written 28 years before Alfred Thayer Mahan published his epical work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. Let's step back and consider the background from which Lenthal viewed how a Navy should operate. The pre-war U.S. Navy was primarily active on foreign stations protecting American interests. In today's jargon, it would be called a forward deployed force. Its light draft harbor defense assets were minimal. In the years immediately before the Civil War, the Navy's principal cruising formations consisted of the home, Mediterranean, Pacific, Brazil, African, and East India squadrons, each populated with steam or sailing frigates and sloops. Now back to Lenthal's letter. He first drew attention to the inability of the Navy Yards to build in iron. He respectfully suggested the absolute necessity of the government at once preparing a factory to make for itself the most important and costly parts, both for the iron hulls and for the armature. The need for a strong Navy to protect from foreign aggression was manifest, for owing to our transoceanic position to the great powers of the world, our security must be sought in a Navy, which is, we respectfully submit, a national question second to none. Now for the letter's true object. The global extent of the naval technological revolution meant that the U.S. had a golden opportunity to start equal with the first powers of the world in a new race for the supremacy of the ocean. All Navy ships had suddenly been rendered obsolete, so all had to start from scratch. Iron hulls were replacing wood, and the latest warships were now clad in iron. And what should the U.S. Navy's new ironclad war steamers look like? The core of the fighting force should be composed of first-class invincible ocean ships, frigate-built iron steamships of sufficient strength to be used as rams, clad with invulnerable armor plates, furnished with maximum steam power. Additionally, subordinate to these, there should be a class of corvettes of the same character, but having a less draft of water. Lenthal reminded his audience the first maritime nations of Europe have been gradually initiating this system. Representatives of both these ship types had or would soon appear in their fleets. France's Gloire as an example of an ironclad frigate, and HMS Research as an armored sloop of war. The core of Lenthal and Isherwood's argument was clear. The most effective ambition for a newly energized America was to preserve our coasts from the presence of an enemy naval force by keeping the command of the open sea with all the power it gives of aggression upon his own shores and commerce, rather than to rely on any system of harbor defense. However, he cautioned, the harbor defenses are indeed valuable adjuncts and should not be neglected, but they cannot constitute a navy or perform its proper functions. This last thought was a not so subtle dig at the monitor lobby. Lenthal's penultimate words, anticipating his ringing conclusion, were, wealth, victory, and empire are to those who command the ocean, the toll gate, as well as the highway of nations. What other events had occurred that caused Lenthal and Isherwood to write his letter? To start with, the recent Crimean War led to the rapid introduction of the ironclad warship. They first appeared as floating batteries in action against Russian forts at Kinburn in the year 1855. Although these earliest ironclads were towed into battle and incapable of sustaining ocean-going operations, the contest of gun against armor had begun. A new race for European powers to build ironclads is underway, with France taking an early lead. Her Gloire, the first seagoing armored battleship, was launched in late 1859 and followed by a fleet of near sisters. Britain was soon to respond with their iron hull and even more revolutionary ironclad frigate, Warrior. The outbreak of the American Civil War had also completely rearranged U.S. Navy priorities. The North quickly declared a blockade of the southern states' 3,500 miles of coastline. This hasty action, in turn, caused Great Britain to grant the Confederacy de facto recognition. Then came the news that the Confederate Navy was hard at work converting the steam frigate Merrimac's hulk into an ironclad. The haunting question loomed: where was the real threat to the Union from? Britain's Navy or the South's next generation warship? The Navy appointed an ironclad board to decide how it should react to the emerging challenges. It was chaired by Commodore Joseph Smith, the chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, and included Commodore Hiram Paulding and Commander Charles Davis. But since the act of Congress that established the board had stipulated its members be skillful naval officers, no naval constructors were appointed. John Lenthal and his bureau were sidelined. However, given the board's relative lack of experience and its absence of a constructor, it made surprisingly good choices from the various ironclads proposed. A frigate-sized war steamer that would be named New Ironsides, a smaller armored sloop of war, Galena, probably its worst choice, and strangest of all, John Ericsson's ironclad steam battery that would go down in history as USS Monitor. The race was on to field the first American-built ironclad, although in the earliest stages, the North had only a dim appreciation of how serious the new danger the new Southern warship might be. It was immediately focused, especially after news of the Trent affair broke in November of 1861, on the possibility of British intervention in the United States Civil War. But we now know how that turned out. British threat receded, but the Southern menace in the form of the ironclad ram Virginia was all too real, as demonstrated by the carnage during the first day at Hampton Roads. So where did John Lenthal's Mahanian insight come from? The first place to look is the basics of a naval constructor's education. He served an apprenticeship under the renowned Samuel Humphreys, the Navy's chief constructor, after which he worked for many years as a U.S. naval constructor. Lenthal also owned a library of more than 400 books, most on the science of ships and a good number in French. This fabulous store of knowledge has been preserved, by the way, and is available to scholars at Philadelphia's Independent Seaport Museum. Lenthal went on to design many of the Navy's most successful warships, his first project being the Dale-class sloops shown here in that inset in the lower left. An early life adventure that set Lenthal apart from his peers was a grand tour of the principal dockyards of Europe. His itinerary encompassed Kronstadt outside of St. Petersburg in Russia, the Royal Danish Dockyard in Copenhagen, the Royal Navy's dockyards at Portsmouth, and probably Woolwich and others, and finally France, where he based himself in Paris and visited the French Navy yards at Lorient, Paimboeuf, and likely several more. Lenthal even managed to get invited to the steam trials of the French paddle aviso Crocodile in 1833. But without doubt, the highlight of his European tour was the 15 months he spent in Paris. There, Lenthal paid numerous visits to the French Navy's Dépôt de la Marine and occupied many long days tracing ship plans. He also attended scientific lectures and mastered the French language. When Lenthal returned to the U.S., he brought with him some 300 drawings of the best European ships of war. This is an experience beyond that of any contemporary U.S. naval constructor. Once Lenthal was back in the United States and resumed his career as a constructor, he maintained his desire to master new technology and keep up with foreign naval developments. One seminal exposure was his participation with John Ericsson in the construction of the world's first warship designed to be driven with a screw propeller, the steam sloop Princeton. Sorry to slight the Royal Navy and similar claims on Rattler. As a biographer of the Swedish inventor remarked, Princeton was in reality Ericsson's first monitor. Further, technical documents found in Lenthal's papers include a table of British warship particulars, a 4-page Royal Navy 211 form for HMS Warrior listing all of her items of deadweight, and 6 pages of technical specifications for the first ocean-going ironclad battleship Gloire. This last document was in Lenthal's hand and in French. Yes, John Lenthal very much had an insider's knowledge of the latest naval technology, both domestic and foreign. So how did Secretary Wells and the Navy Department react to John Lenthal's letter? Lenthal's advice was superficially acknowledged and perfectly implemented, but his vision was largely ignored. Gideon Wells' primary focus was on beating the South. To do that, he was convinced monitors were needed to prosecute the war. And so, in a space of a year, he ordered 39 more of Ericsson's monitors, 10 improved Passaic class in the spring of 1862, 9 enlarged Canonicus class in the fall of 1862, and 20 light draft Casco class in the spring of 1863. That's a lot of monitors. But Secretary Wells also knew he had to guard American shores against a European attack. The menace of Britain still hovered, and France, with its puppet Emperor Maximilian installed in Mexico, was a hazard. So Wells felt compelled to order William Webb's huge ironclad frigate ram Dunderberg and even more monitor-type ironclads. These included 2 Erickson Swift turret carriers, Dictator and Puritan, a Morgan Iron Works design, the iron-hulled Onondaga, 4 Navy Department designs, the double-turreted Monadnock class, and a Navy Department design conversion of the steam frigate Roanoke. But look at their legacies. Dunderberg was finished too late and wasn't accepted by the U.S. Navy. After the war, she was sold to the French, as was Onondaga. Dictator missed the war, and Puritan was never completed. And Roanoke, a powerful ocean-going triple-turreted ironclad, proved to be an unsuccessful attempt to economically convert an existing warship. And so that left the Navy with the Monadnock class of double-turreted ironclads, creations of Lenthal's Navy Department, as their first line of defense. The Monadnocks were judged by the U.S. navies to be the best of the Civil War ironclads. 2 of them managed ocean crossings, but their hasty construction from green timber meant their hulls were soon rotten and unserviceable. Then, in late 1873, the Virginius affair dramatically exposed just how obsolete the Navy's fleet of aged monitors really was. It found itself severely hobbled by its brown water legacy. If war had broken out with Spain, U.S. ports would have been hostage to a handful of powerful Spanish ironclad frigates. America had risked being humbled by a second-tier power. Recovery from the Navy's decline was painfully slow. The systematic corruption of President Grant's Secretary of the Navy, George Robeson, together with Congress's lack of funding, added just 10 new warships in 8 years. However, Robeson's creative accounting did allow for the, quote, rebuilding, unquote, of 5 Civil War-era monitors, 4 of which were Lenthal's Monadnocks. But many years passed before the new Garfield administration, Secretary William Hunt appointed advisory boards to guide the Navy into a brighter future. John Lenthal and Benjamin Isherwood were recalled from retirement to serve on the first board. Thus began the new Steel Navy, which resulted in the trend-setting ABCD ships. The way forward was now clear. Lenthal and Isherwood's words had an impact far beyond their original 1862 audience. Hopefully, this paper has illustrated their influence, if somewhat delayed, on the U.S. Navy's strategic thinking. Others took notice too, one of them being England's Sir Thomas Brassey, author of an influential series of books titled The British Navy, Its Strengths, Resources, and Administration. Although John Lenthal died in 1882, the year before its publication, perhaps his colleague at the Bureau of Construction and later a bureau chief in his own right, Benjamin Isherwood, rejoiced to see their vision firmly embraced by the fellow U.S. Navy officer. In 1890, Alfred Thayer Mahan published his famous work, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, how much better it is to fight at the threshold than upon the hearthstone. Thank you for your kind attention.
Stephen, thank you very much for that excellent paper and for your excellent and commendable time management. Much appreciated.
You're welcome.
Andrew Blackley will now present his paper, Albert P. Niblack and the Formation of the Modern U.S. Navy, 1890 to 1917. And I will just remark before I sit down that I was remiss in introducing Andrew. I had marked down and meant to say that he is one of our winners of the C&O essay contest this year and received his award at the luncheon yesterday. So congratulations.
Thank you,
again on that.
All right. Albert P. Niblack, I pronounce it Niblack. I'm assuming that is correct.
I will defer to you.
Okay. In the formation of the modern U.S. Navy, 1890 to 1917. This is actually part of a much bigger work. So I'm just going to cover part one today, the first half of Niblack's career from 1880 to 1903. Next slide, please. Niblack is often treated more as a footnote in most publications. I don't believe that there's an actual dedicated work to him that I've found. Usually his classmate, William S. Sims, who also was his best friend and his roommate at the Naval Academy in class of 1880, gets more attention. Sims and his other classmate, Hugh Rodman, all would finish their careers as flag officers. I believe that Niblack's career from 1880 to 1923 is a great mirror on the Navy, spanning this transformation of the Navy from a peace Navy. And the one photograph, I don't know how well you can see it, was actually taken by Midshipman Niblack during the cruise of the USS Lackawanna in the South Seas in 1880. And you can see a very traditional sailors and sailing rig. And then the picture below is the USS Michigan, battleship 27, which Niblack commanded in 1914 to 1915, the first class of the United States dreadnoughts. And truly, when Niblack finished his career in 1923, the U.S. Navy was indeed equal to the Royal Navy and certainly second to none. Next slide. His career milestones, I just go through these pretty quickly. Importantly, he was a signal officer early on as an ensign. One thing I'll point out here, both Sims and Niblack coming into the Navy at sort of the doldrums experienced a very long wait time to advance in rank. So he did not become a lieutenant until 16 years after he was out of the academy, and a lieutenant commander almost 20 years. So he was a signal officer. He was a flag lieutenant on the USS New York on the North Atlantic Squadron. He was naval attaché in Berlin, Vienna, and Rome. He had a very commendable war record, serving on the USS Topeka with Commander W.S. Coles, who also happens to be the brother-in-law of Teddy Roosevelt. He also had an excellent war record in the Philippine-American War, where he was involved in combined Army and Navy operations. In 2 instances, at least, he provided fire support to Army landings. And at the landing of Ilo in February of 1899, he actually beat the Army on shore and secured the landing zone. Most importantly, and this is where I'm going to concentrate a bit today, in 1901, he was appointed the inspector of target practice. He had been involved in the Philippines surveying Subic Bay. That was one of his career strengths. Was he was a hydrographer and a surveyor, and he did a lot of mapping early in his career in the Alaska archipelago, and he would continue that work in the Philippines and later in his career in the Hawaiian Islands. Other important things here to note: he was here at the academy as the officer in charge of practice ships. He again was a naval attaché as a captain in Buenos Aires, Berlin, and The Hague. Again, captain of the USS Michigan. He served time on the General Board and attended the Naval War College. He's also well known thanks to a book put out several years ago, edited by John Hattendorf, Putting Cargoes Through is the title. This was based on an unpublished article he'd written for Proceedings that described his activities as commander of the 2nd Squadron Patrol Force at Gibraltar. And here he was serving under his old roommate, Admiral Sims. He served time as naval attaché in London. As vice admiral, he was in command of the U.S. naval forces in Europe, and he retired in 1923. Next slide. One thing about Niblack, he was very much a prolific writer. There was at least 27 articles in Proceedings in the period of 1890 to 1928. 2 of these were prize essays in 1891 and 1896, and also several honorable mentions. His writing typically was based on a previous recent assignment. He was writing, especially in this early part of his career, an article at least on average once every 2 years. Topics that he covered: training and organization of the new Navy, signal communications, especially flag and daytime and using lights in nighttime signaling. This is in the pre-wireless era. He wrote on combined operations, as I've mentioned. In particular, he was interested in fleet tactics, and later in his career on U.S. naval policy. I think that taking his writing and his work in context will provide a revealing look at the transformation of the U.S. Navy prior to the First World War. Next slide. I'm not going to go through this in a lot of detail. The point of this is just to show all his various assignments. Being an engineer, I put his career into a spreadsheet and I'm showing here in context to the articles that he wrote in the same time frame, just to give some idea that of what he was doing. So he was producing, for example, articles on signaling after he had served as the signal lieutenant on the Chicago and the Squadron of Evolution. He produced a prize essay, which I'm going to cover here in a minute, when he was the flag lieutenant on the USS New York, as in the North Atlantic Squadron. Next slide. Continuing in the summary, and we can come back to this some more at a different point, but again, he had an excellent war record in the Spanish-American War. He, on the China station, like I said, he did a survey of Subic Bay and made a recommendation that that should be the location of the new U.S. naval station in the Philippines, and importantly, became the first inspector of target practice in 1901. Next slide. The first prize essay that he wrote in 1891 on the enlistment, training, and organization of crews for our new ships. This was based on his experience on the USS Chicago, which, as Stephen had mentioned, I should say thank you to Stephen. His paper is an excellent introduction into the era that Niblack inherited. The old wooden-hulled ships like the Lackawanna were replaced by the ABCD cruisers, one of which was, of course, the Chicago. But he had some criticisms of it. He thought they were cramped and too hot, and he made recommendations for improving the habitability of these ships for the crews, to provide a central mess. But one of the most important things that he was concerned about was to make enlisted service an attractive career choice for young men. That he wanted to elevate the career of being an enlisted sailor from this image of the roustabout jolly sailor to being a professional seaman who is going to be part of an active team running and operating these new ships along with their officers. And to that end, he recommended replacing the old watch bill that was in use based on sailing to one based on gunnery. Another significant thing that he recommended, and actually William Fulham preceded him in this to some degree, was to reduce or eliminate the Marine contingent on board U.S. warships. At the time, the Marines were still functioning in their classic function as the police on board and the security detail, in effect to protect the officers from the unruly crew. And he thought that that was no longer appropriate. The crewmen are now part of the team, and they need to be treated as such, and they need to be treated as respectable individuals. And he felt that the sailors could easily police themselves, that the Marines should be eliminated, at least reduced to something more of a gun crew. His big point was that no one on board ship, there should be no one on board ship who wasn't actively engaged in the operation of the ship. He considered the Marines more like a supercargo. Next slide, please. His prize essay for 1896 was Tactics of the Ship of the Line in Battle. This is somewhat of a derivative article, but nevertheless, it was the prize essay. A lot of what he wrote was based on previous work by Foxhall Parker, who actually wrote the textbook that he and Sims used at the Academy. William Bainbridge Hoff had 2 years before had come out with an extensive manual on called Elementary Fleet Tactics, and they all sort of revolved around this one. This is a sample illustration from the Fleet Drill Book. I actually have a copy of this original from 1888. This was very much a confidential document at the time, but it's full of very unrealistic maneuvers like this. And as Dr. Renfro can testify based on his work, this was at a time when the U.S. Navy could barely scrape together more than a handful of ships at any one time. And to propose maneuvers like this unpracticed would be a recipe for disaster. Nevertheless, he believed that modern ships of this era were mostly designed with strong bow gunnery and frontal armor, and therefore he believed that the line abreast was the best formation. He and Bainbridge Hoff believed in the idea of charge through, that the two formations would charge at each other at high speed, run through each other, and whoever could turn around the fastest and attack the rear of the other would be the one to have victory. Again, another recipe for disaster. In theory, the idea was that you would turn around, disable the enemy with gunfire, and then you would finish him off with the ram. Torpedoes would be definitely secondary because they were felt at the time that a torpedo could be just as dangerous to your own forces as to that of the enemy, especially in the melee tactics that he was talking about. So these unrealistic tactics are just a sign of the fact that that both the author and the reviewers didn't really have any realistic experience of naval warfare, and they pretty much ignored the recent Battle of the Yalu, which had taken place in September of 1894. I got my numbers misplaced there. Which the Japanese used a column formation against the Chinese line abreast with great success. Next slide, please. So one of the things I wanted to concentrate on in this talk is Niblack's time as inspector of target practice. Most of what we hear about from this time period is based on Elting Morrison's Admiral Sims in the Modern American Navy. Morrison, of course, was Sims' biographer and also his son-in-law. And Sims is given very much a heroic treatment in that book. And Niblack, where he appears, is sort of a failure by comparison, I believe. The book is an excellent secondary source, however, for the correspondence. Morrison had access to Sims' papers, and Sims and Niblack at this period were very frequent correspondents, so it does make an excellent source. Other sources I used, by the way, also included the archives at the Indiana Historical Society and the East Carolina University have archives of Niblack's papers that were their archivists there were very forthcoming in their help and assistance, and also the online Roosevelt papers from the Library of Congress are extremely helpful. So, according to Sims' official biography, it still appears on the website of the Navy History and Historical Command. Sims supposedly had written a letter to Roosevelt and describing the terrible shooting of the North Atlantic Squadron, and supposedly Roosevelt had a pyrotechnic explosion and said, "Bring him back right away and put him in charge of target practice." This actually didn't, and this supposedly happened in February of 1902. In fact, Sims did not become inspector of target practice until November of 1902. The events, as I see them, based on the correspondence, was well. Let's go on to the next slide here for a second. Okay, so sort of the chronology of events here. Sims was on the China Station at the time, and he was sending back reports to the Bureau of Ordnance and the Bureau of Navigation, very much touting the achievements of Percy Scott of the Royal Navy and his gunnery training, and making recommendations that should be adopted by the U.S. Navy. In August, and this was going on in the spring of 1901. In August of 1901, the North Atlantic Squadron this was the terrible target practice that Sims was referring to in his letter. off Nantucket, the North Atlantic Squadron in 5 ships, 5 minutes each, only managed to score 2 hits on an anchored lighthouse hulk. They actually had to close to point blank range to actually sink it. Somehow this got to the newspapers. It was in the New York Sun, and they were then ordered to go to the southern drill grounds off the Virginia Capes. Again, they didn't shoot very well. Niblack was in correspondence with Sims and tells him about this terrible shooting. Niblack tells him at the time that he was being considered to become the first inspector of target practice. In the same time frame, William McKinley is assassinated, and Theodore Roosevelt becomes president. And this this was obviously to Sims' advantage, unfortunately for McKinley. That might have been, I hate to say that, might be one of the best things that happened to the U.S. Navy in that time period. Nevertheless, can I take this off?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay. So then Sims wrote his famous letter directly to Teddy Roosevelt, describing the poor shooting that Niblack told him about, and he enclosed copies of all the reports that he had previously sent to the Navy Department, and said point blank in the letter that this poor performance of the U.S. Navy was a matter of national security. Roosevelt did take that seriously. He did write Sims a letter back and kind of gently chastised him for saying, he reminded Sims of the fact that when Sims was the attaché in Madrid, that he had told Teddy Roosevelt when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy that he thought the Spanish ships were better than the American ships. And Roosevelt said, you were wrong about that. And so Roosevelt then asks his brother-in-law, William Cowles, who is now his naval advisor, to take a look at these reports and give him an assessment. Well, Cowles then gave this assignment to Niblack. And Niblack did go through all those reports. He synthesized the reports and wrote a memo on it, and he very much was in complete agreement with everything that Sims had written, and he validated Sims' reports and gave a recommendation that Sims' recommendation should be adapted. This he gave to H.C. Taylor as well. So in January of 1902, Roosevelt instructs Admiral Taylor to send copies of this memo to all the senior commanders in the Navy with instructions to start modifying target practice immediately. Next slide, please. One of the things that is downplayed and that Sims was not fully aware of was the terrific financial side of all that was involved here. In April 1902, in the fiscal year for fiscal year 1902, there was only $12,000 set aside for gunnery exercises, and this was rapidly being exhausted. In fact, by April of 1902, it was exhausted for that fiscal year. In July of 1902, main gunnery practice for the next fiscal year had to be halted due to lack of funds. And so in his annual report for 1902, Taylor recommended increasing this amount by 10 times to $120,000 for the next appropriation. Congress, however, would not be looking at that appropriation until March of 1903. In this time period, Niblack was busy setting up target galleries and conducting inspections of gunnery practice. There were improvements in gunnery practice, especially with the Kearsarge in May of 1902. It did improve its target practice, but in general, the improvement was still needed. In the August-September timeframe, Niblack came down with tuberculosis. So Niblack, in June of 1902, had taken his examination for promotion to lieutenant commander. He had passed his physical at that time completely, but sometime they apparently missed the diagnosis with tuberculosis. And due to his poor health, he had to retire as the inspector of target practice. And so on September 28, 1902, Taylor recalls Sims from China Station. And on November of 1902, Niblack is formally relieved as inspector of target practice, replaced by Sims. So things, I think, went well for Sims in a couple different ways, and I'll elaborate here in a minute. A lot of the groundwork had been laid by Niblack and Taylor in the Bureau of Navigation to um, to help Sims become successful in 1903 and 1904. So another thing that helped Sims become a success was the geopolitics at the time with the Venezuela crisis. The president ordered the various U.S. squadrons to come together into a combined fleet in the Caribbean. And during that time, Sims visited the fleet and did extensive continuous aim training using non-live fire methods, using the Dodder and the Morris tube. And then the crews became quite proficient in this cheap method of target practice. And then when March 1903, Congress did appropriate $120,000 for gunnery exercises, then they began in earnest with live firing. And that really did mark the beginning, I think, of the U.S. Navy's gunnery revolution. Next slide. So this shows an illustration of the Dodder. Even in 1901, before Niblack became the inspector of target practice, they were based on Sims' recommendations and the reports that they received from him, they were starting to buy the Dodder device from England. They had some issues with them. They had to rebuild them. They weren't entirely satisfied with them, but they were being purchased and starting to be distributed into the fleet. In 1902, the spring of 1902, the Dodders were sent to the Asiatic Squadron, where Sims at that time was the inspector of target practice for the Asiatic Squadron. Based on Sims' recommendations, targets were modified to be 16 foot tall and 20 foot wide, and this is an example of one from the target practice of the USS Maine in 1903. This is felt to be a much better target to aim at, as the previous targets were too tall and too narrow, and too long, I should say, and too short. That was a problem. The problems with gunnery often have to do with elevation and not so much in training. So it was better to have a taller target than a long narrow target. Continuous aim training was beginning to be adopted, and this is also very important. Sims always had a running battle with Charles O'Neill, who was the chief of the Bureau of Ordnance. They really didn't get along at all, but nevertheless, even though O'Neill had some skepticism about continuous aim, he nevertheless ordered that the gun mounts be redesigned, and where they could be modified on existing ships, that they be so modified so you would have a separate position for a gun pointer who did the elevation and the gun trainer. The gun pointer would be on the left, the gun trainer on the right. In the past, the gun pointer had both of those jobs, and at the same time, he also was trying to look over open sights, which of course made it very, very difficult to keep a sight picture and keep on target. It was critical then for both the Dodder training and the Morris tube training that you had to have telescopic sights installed. These were still problematic, and the next in 03 and 04, Sims would continue to battle the Bureau of Ordnance for better optical sights. Next slide. So, as I alluded in a previous slide, Niblack, due to his health problems, had to go to Fort Bayard in New Mexico for treatment. But nevertheless, he did produce another article, and this was presented to the Society of Marine Architects and Naval Engineers, Naval Architects and Marine Engineers, in November of 1902. Niblack was not able to be there in person. It was presented by somebody else. This article also appeared at the same time in Proceedings, and this little picture here is where I picked that up. And in that article, this is a refinement of his previous article, a great leap forward, where his tactics of the gun are much more realistic than they had been previously. This was still in an era before long-range gunnery. The gun range was considered to be 1,000 to 3,000 yards, 1,000 yards as a minimum because you wanted to avoid torpedo fire from the enemy. So that was considered to be the best range in which to engage the enemy with gunfire. Again, they were aware of the effect of plunging fire, but they didn't feel that was realistic because they could not, at the time, the range finding equipment just did not yet exist. And so in this article, Niblack makes some recommendations in order to concentrate gunfire. He believes that he still believes in this approach that ships should approach the enemy initially in echelon, in other words, at a 45-degree angle formation that would maximize both bow fire and broadside fire, depending on where the enemy was at. But once you started to attack the enemy, you would go into a column formation as shown here, and then you would attack in column, that is in line ahead, to maximize your broadside fire. You would maneuver to concentrate fire. Important concept here that he enunciated was it was extremely important to hit hardest and hit first. And here he mentioned something very important, that increasing your own offensive power, that to hit first and to eliminate some of the enemy's gunfire would increase your own offensive power in a geometrical ratio as you destroy his. So this is in advance of the Lanchester equations. Bradley Fisk and Sims both later on enunciated similar things, 1904, 1905, in articles that they had in proceedings. But this is the first time I've actually seen this geometrical ratio mentioned in one of these tactical articles. And as a coda in this article, he also recommended the increase in spending on gun retraining from $12,000 a year to $120,000 a year. Next slide. So again, this is finishing his career. Let's go to the next slide. On the end of his career, very important, as I say, he was in charge of the patrol force in Gibraltar. He was director of naval intelligence. He was the naval attaché in London and commander of U.S. naval forces operating in Europe in 1920-22. He oversaw the decommissioning of the Austrian fleet, and he retired in 1923. He then became head of the International Hydrographic Bureau, and that was again something that he had a lot of experience in, and he died in Monaco in 1929. And then he was made advanced to Vice Admiral posthumously in 1930. Last slide. I'll end it there. We see Niblack as a Rear Admiral and escorting Admiral of the Fleet Viscount John Jellicoe when he visited Washington in 1920. So this is just a short overview of the beginning of Niblack's career, and this is an ongoing project that I'm going to continue to work on. That concludes my talk.
All right, thanks very much for that, Andrew. And now finally, Pedro Penera Martinez will present his paper, The Emergence of New Naval Power, Intelligence Reports from the Spanish Legation in Washington regarding the development of the U.S. Navy 1890-1980.
Well, thank you, Dr. Renfro, for your introduction. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to the organizers of the symposium for giving me the opportunity to be here with all of you today. Secondly, I would like to apologize for my language limitations. As you may have already noticed, because of my accent, my first language is Spanish, and I am totally aware that my English is not the best. Because of that, please feel free to request me to clarify anything if I do not properly explain myself. Well, as the presenter has already said, I'm going to talk about the intelligence report provided by the Spanish legation in Washington regarding the development of the U.S. Navy and the U.S. coastal artillery in the last decade of the 19th century. Well, going down to business, La Habana Naval Base was in mid-19th century one of the main sources of intelligence regarding the development of the U.S. Navy. Accordingly, a letter of 1865, the commanding general of the Spanish Navy in Cuba warned Madrid about the visit made to the island by an American squadron commanded by Rear Admiral Godon. His fleet included two monitors, the USS Monadnock and the USS Canonicus. Such a visit offered to the Spanish authorities the possibility of getting to know firsthand about those avant-garde ships and to judge their capabilities. Being the report of a very significant value for the Spanish Navy, when it said, and I quote, the largest of these monitors was the Monadnock, Her hull is made of wood and the configuration of the master frame is almost flat. The armor is made of iron bands, and she has two towers placed on the stern and both sides of the engine, which occupies the center of the ship. And these towers are each armed with two smoothbore guns of 15 inches in diameter, which fire solid steel projectiles weighing 500 pounds each. End of the quote. The damage produced to the ship during the Battle of Charleston was described as insignificant to the eye, and the report went on describing the USS Canonicus in a very similar way. Both ships were defined as formidable war machines because of their thick artillery and their invulnerability. In short, it was considered that the arrival of these ships to the Cuban shores showed the enormous means that the United States Navy was achieving. That in a short time will make it easily for the U.S. Navy to attack the Spanish positions, as the little or no resistance that we can present to them to stop those ships will to invade our ports. Even it was determined that the monitors could threat not only the defenses of the ports overseas, but also of those in the peninsula. Accordingly, it does not surprise the fact that shortly after Madrid deployed a naval commission in Philadelphia, reinforced in 1875 with a naval attaché office to the legation in Washington, which surely had provided to Madrid with information regarding the strengthening of the US naval power. In any way, the civil staff of the Spanish legation to the US was able to provide relevant info about this issue, more precisely because of a request from the governor and captain general of the island of Cuba. The legation in Washington sent a very interesting report in which the latest works carried out by the US regarding the coastal fortifications and the development of the US Navy were highlighted. The first part referred to the coastal defenses and their upcoming program of improvements, although it did not go as far as recommending the immediate beginning of the hostilities. After analyzing the contemporary defensive strength of the U.S. ports and consider their future development, it was determined that by 1891 all American harbors could be put at the mercy of a simple battleship like the Pelayo one, which could enter to any port of the nation and impose a heavy war contribution with the threat of bombardment without fearing or suffering great damages. This was because only because the ports. This was because only the ports of New York, Boston, San Francisco, and Washington, and of course Hampton Roads, had begun to be fortified at that time. The report also described the budgets and the pieces expected for the years to come, and evidently New York City, as the most important city in the country and the one with the most unfavored coastline conditions, as it was going to capitalize the principal, the main works. It was projected to include numerous concealed and swallowed batteries at Sandy Hook, Coney Island, and Staten Island, where up to 144 12-inch mortars were alleged to be mounted in the short cone. But the plans also include to equip the secondary ports of Key West, Pensacola, Galveston, Charleston, and Mobile in a 10-year period. But the ambitious constructions were considered almost impossible to be materialized in the time program by the US, according to the Spanish personnel. It was thought that the foundries at Midvale and Bethlehem unlikely could produce the required tons of steel to enable the national factories at Washington and Waterloo to produce the guns, no matter if the budget included large provisions of dollars for purchasing steel or enlarging the factories. The second part of the report, less lavish in detail, show that it was in the development of the fleet where the US was making the most rapid progress, for they had launched and have now in service five protected cruisers of the type or our Reina Regente class, the report said. After giving a brief account of the number of guns these new vessels had, it went on note that more ships will be commissioned in the coming months, including several avisos, the powerful protector cruisers USS Newark and USS Maine, five 600-ton monitors, and three battleships. In addition, works had begun on the production of up to 8 protected cruisers, and a contract had just been signed to produce three battleships, which, in the words of the U.S. Navy Secretary, will not be surpassed by the most powerful afloat at the sea to that time. In addition to this type of interesting news, delegation in Washington was not only able to provide the Spanish authorities with exclusive information on the development of the U.S. Navy, also it was developed a whole network of espionage and intelligence that, with greater or lesser success, monitorized the activities of the American filibusters and the supports they gave to Cuban rebels, especially with regard to the introduction of troops and weapons in the island, activity in which the consulate in New York was also active. But returning to the monitorizing made by delegation regarding the development of the U.S. naval forces, the material provided by the military attaché in Washington, Carlos de la Casa Carnicer, stands out. This young artillery captain of 27 years of age and Cuban by birth was appointed to the U.S. in 1893. Almost immediately after taking up his post, he began to send very useful info, including a review of the experiments being carried out in the United States on steel armor plates and a presumable report about the organization of the militias from each important state in 1896, which having come up to light and its existence is only known thanks to some references. At the end of the same year, Captain de la Casa issued several reports to the Spanish Minister of War, in which he consigned statistics concerning the American forces. Unfortunately, only one of those reports has came to light to date, the one corresponding to October 1896. Although from its content, we can deduce that he issued at least two more. In any case, the young captain detailed the war budget and commented that the last experiences carried out by the naval artillery of the main U.S. Navy ships. With regard to the budgets, which he broke down in detail, he pointed out how the item dedicated to coastal defenses was the largest expense, with almost $16 million. He noted that the chapter dedicated to coastal artillery had increased drastically in the previous years. And I am quoting, until 1890, the coastal artillery financial plan did not exist, and in that year it appeared in the budget with a sum of $1,200,000 destined for the construction of artillery batteries equipped with mortars and modern cannons. In 1891, $150,000 were destined to that object, remaining this amount the successive years until the present increase. End of the quote. To that date, he said the U.S. had succeeded in fortifying the following ports: Boston, Hampton Roads, Portland, San Francisco, and Washington. Of course, he included a detailed description of the composition of the batteries in these harbors, and evidently the attaché focused his reports on New York City because of its special vulnerability to be attacked by sea, and since it was the most heavily protected city to that date. He carefully described the defenses to such point that he even located in a series of maps the exact location of the defenses, the batteries, and also he carefully indicated the water depth, data from which he believed a landing operation against the city could be studied. On such map, de la Casa will have noted the forts of Sandy Hook, Fort Wadsworth, Fort Hamilton, and Wheeler's Point. The last one he considered as the weakest point of the city's defensive system, as it practically gave freeway through Long Island Sound for any attacking fleet due to its poor artillery, reduced only to two 10-inch guns and three unmounted 3-inch cannons. Regarding the firing experiments against fixed targets carried out by the Navy in September 1898, the attaché was able to provide Madrid with abundant data on the number of guns carried by each American capital ships, the number of ammunition they load, the rates of fire, and the possible duration of their sustained fire until all the ammunition was consumed. The conclusions he drew from the analysis of such data were that the rapid ammunition consumption of the American vessels due to the use of rapid fire guns could lead to their collapse at the critical moment of the battle, which could mean that some ships, like the USS Riley, will quickly run out of ammunition. And I quote, at the most distressing moment of the battle, and when she will be in the best conditions for sustaining it because its service could have been able to normalize and correct the firing, but instead she will be forced to silence its more powerful guns. Given this, de la Casa did not consider that the North Atlantic Squadron would operate far from its coasts and ports of resupply. He supposed that even if they receive orders to bombard a well-defended place like La Habana, it could well happen that the Spanish squadron will make its appearance when the American ammunition were about to be consumed, and therefore the Americans will be in a very unfavorable condition for combat. The US Navy therefore could not launch any attack against the Canary Islands or the peninsula unless assisted by many transport ships loaded to the brim with ammunition and coal. And this was a detail that would not go unnoticed in the analysis of the military attaché, who believed that the design of American ships had been given too much space for the steam boilers to detriment of the space to load coal and ammunition. Supposedly, this would have been a consequence of the grand benefits by the government to the shipbuilders when the maximum speed of a new ship exceeded the stipulated manufactured conditions. According to him, that means sacrificing the combat conditions of the vessels for the sake of their ability to escape. Finally, he conceded that the great success of the US Navy will be the enormous tactical advantage offered by the use of medium caliber rapid fire guns, being capable of delivering an even greater amount of shell weight than the heavier caliber prefers by Spain, a fact for which he considered the artillery of the USS Raleigh and the USS Cincinnati 3 times more powerful than the one of the USS Newark, although all the three had the same number of guns. In conclusion, it only remains to point out that it was not only the legation of Washington, the one that stood out in the provision of information on the military and naval development of the United States. The artillery colonel Manuel Echagüe, assigned to the legation in Brussels, was proposed to be decorated in 900 with the Cross of Military Merit, third class, for the service he rendered in relation to the surveillance and of the expeditions of weapons to America in the previous years. But not much information has been found about his actions. So through the present minutes, a brief account of the information provided by the Spanish legation in Washington to the Spanish authorities has been provided, as well as a succinct explanation of the data collected in such reports sent by the legation, duly contextualized in a coherent way regarding Spanish ambitions to keep updated in a scenario in which the outbreak of a conflict with the US was more than probable. Finally, the main line of research opened by this research could be a detailed study of the reports simultaneously sent by the Spanish naval attaches that I haven't been able to look after yet, and also a deeper research of the consideration made by those attaches regarding the doctrinal and tactical influence derived by the introduction of the new ships and artillery in the U.S., if any, and also a wider chronological approach to the topic in order to fully include the period encompassed between the 1860s and the 1898. And that's all from now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you for that excellent paper, Pedro, and I promise you that your English is much better than my Spanish. It's the task of a commentator to try to find some commonalities and some themes that run through the three papers, and often that can be a very daunting challenge, and quite a bit of sort of kabuki has to be done in order to figure out some sort of a common theme. Thankfully today that is not the case. And while it's tempting to talk about the transformation of the U.S. Navy, I think what I would rather point out specifically to the midshipmen who are sitting in the room here is that the three papers that you've heard today ought to really reinforce you guys that for every line in your textbook, that there's one sentence that says, one thing that you have to learn for a fact for an exam. There's a multitude of information out there and a multitude of people and personalities and experiences that inform those things. So in our first paper, we heard about constructor Lenthal. Most of you probably heard of Alfred Thayer Mahan, but Mahan was simply the guy that was able to put pen to paper in an effective way and write about sea power. And so today we teach all about Mahanian theories and ideas and stuff like that, but this stuff had been percolating for at least 2 decades prior to the time that Mahan wrote in the late 19th century. And it was the work of people like Constructor Lenthal, people he was not a line naval officer, he was a naval constructor. And he had very specific ideas about shipbuilding because that's what he did for a living. And he felt that we should be purchasing certain kinds of ships. And there was an enormous amount of debate that went on about what the new Navy should look like and why it should look that way. And you can follow all of this in the Proceedings magazines from that time period. The debate that goes back and forth between line officers and staff officers and constructors and people, what are the political ramifications of what kinds of ships that we need to build, or what are the practical ramifications? Is there enough steel to build all these ships, and so on and so forth. And I think Stephen's paper does an excellent job of bringing that to light with a nice piece of primary source material to show us these kinds of conversations that are happening not in the early and mid 1890s, but in the 1880s and the late 1870s. So Mahan really is kind of the author and the writer about this stuff, but he's not the person that comes up with these ideas of sea power and America as a global nation. And then I would say that the exact same thing about Niblack. I'll stick with your pronunciation. Right. You guys eventually are going to be forced to learn about sims, and you'll probably have to answer a test question to the effect that sims and gunnery have something to do with each other. But there's so much more behind that. We purchased all these ships in the late 19th century and have absolutely no idea whatsoever how to use the weapons on them. I mean, other than we're teaching the sailors to load them and fire them, and that's it. How do you aim something at something 5 miles away in the absence of radar, in the absence of telescopic sights, in the absence of any of this stuff? It's like, imagine you're on a boat in Nelson's Navy and you're sort of putting wooden wedges underneath a cannon to try to loft it, and you're not doing a whole lot better in the 1890s. And how they worked through that, and how it's junior officers, it's people like Niblack that are working this out. And again, they're writing about it in Proceedings. And so when the Naval Institute comes around to your company areas and they offer you these free memberships in the Naval Institute and they hand out proceedings magazines and stuff, take them and read them, because the people today, like there's a great article in the magazine this month about what should naval flight officers do now that we're getting away from manned aircraft, and this idea of sort of the big NFO. I was a naval flight officer. The big NFO in the sky with all of his sort of remotely controlled airplanes. But this is the kind of stuff that we're thinking about in the 21st century. NIDLAC is having these exact same conversations. It's just about how to fire a 19th century gun. And Andrew's work really shows you all of the behind the scenes stuff that is going into that one line in the textbook. And then finally, about Pedro's paper, I will admit this as the guy who wrote the chapter in your textbook about the Spanish-American War. Okay, so when you read that, that's me talking. But we had, the Spanish-American War, or the War of 1898, is difficult for us as Americans to deal with, because it's we're obviously sort of acting the bully. There's a lot of questions of colonialism and race and identity and all sorts of things that are wrapped up in the War of 1898, and it's hard for us to kind of approach. And so the way that we do that in typical American fashion is to sort of not give the Spanish any agency whatsoever at all. There were all these kind of Spanish ships. We showed up, we blew them all up, and then we left. And what Pedro's paper, in the excellent work in primary source Spanish language sources, goes to show us that there is a lot going on the other side of that, and that the Spanish do have agency, and that they are thinking about what was happening, and they do understand their intelligence reports, and they realize that the North Atlantic Squadron's gunnery was awful, and I can attest to that, having been through all those gunnery reports myself. And they're making real rational decisions based on the intelligence that they have. Now, the outcome of the War of 1898 didn't particularly go the way that they wanted it, but it is not this sort of black box that we as Americans tend to present it, like there was no other logical outcome except that we would have won the Battle of Manila Bay and the Battle of Santiago de Cuba, right? So, and Pedro's work, I think, shows us that today. So again, I'm going to wrap my comments with just this theme that beware of those sentence or two in your textbooks that says Mahan did this, and understand that it is the work of historians to get underneath those sentences that make it to your textbook and make it much richer and more contextualized and really tell the full story. With those comments, I would like to open it to the floor for questions for any of the three of our panelists.
Can I start off?
Please do, sir.
This is a question for Pedro. You said that the Spanish naval attaché got some very detailed information, especially about the defenses in New York Harbor, as far as the actual gun locations and the depth of the channel and so on. How did they collect that information? Was that just in the open, or did they, was it spying? How did they get that information?
Well, I am not really sure the way he achieved that information, but it is quite interesting when we make an approach to the naval archives, and we found that kind of maps from Japan in that very same last decade of the 19th century. And in the case of the defenses of New York, I had no idea the way he achieved to achieve such information. But in the case of the Japanese main naval bases, the naval attaché in Tokyo shared the information with the other power that was threatened by the Japanese naval expansion, the Russian military attaché in Tokyo at that time. So I suppose that he went there and draw the positions and take information just, as you said, open sources. But in other cases, there was some certain of collaboration with other attachés.
Well, the reason I asked that is Niblack, in his writing, he was a naval attaché on several occasions, and he always claimed that he did not have to resort to gumshoe, he called it, nefarious means of collecting information. Everything he got, he said, was from either open source or being told by the naval officers that he worked with, but it was all above board. He didn't have to resort to spying. He didn't like the concept of the naval.
It is funny because I wrote that, I read that in your paper, and it is true that Artillery Captain Baruch, United States military attaché in Paris, in the last decade of the 19th century, he was arrested by the French police because he was purchasing information about the artillery defense of the Toulon harbor, the cities, the southern Mediterranean French cities harbor defenses. So I suppose that, and when he came back to the United States, he alleged that a lot of military attachés back in Europe were purchasing information. So I found interesting that some years later, Ned Black said that his reports were gained legally and by sharing information.
Thank you.
Let me offer a comment on that question too. In the earlier era in which I was writing, during the Virginia's affair, 1873, the big concern of the United States Navy was the fact that at that very moment, the Spanish frigate, ironclad frigate, Arapiles, I think is how you pronounce it, was
Arapiles.
Pardon?
Yeah, correct. Arapiles.
Arapiles was in the New York Navy Yard being repaired from a grounding incident. And the realization struck the Navy officials that if war broke out and this ship was loose in New York Harbor, they had nothing to match it. They only had these aged monitors, but nothing blue water. So you can imagine the officers on that Spanish frigate just taking notes, listening to what their contemporaries are saying, and sending reports back to Madrid.
Yes, of course, this was a very common way of collecting data. Usually, the naval attaché system was developed with some decades later to the military attaché system because of that privative way of obtaining information, the notes that the officers took during the visits to the harbors and ports in other countries.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions from the floor here in the room. Sir, go ahead.
Una presentación excelente, don Pedro, lo felicito. It was an excellent presentation, don Pedro. I congratulate you. So I have two questions for you. I'm going to ask the questions first in English, and then I'm going to ask you in Spanish out of courtesy for clarity for you. You can just answer them in English. Given, first of all, as the moderator said, it's great to have this vantage view on the information that the Spanish had prior to the Spanish-American War. I have two questions about that. Given that they have all this information and presumably the Spanish Navy was not planning to invade New York, I am perplexed that they did not learn some of these lessons and fortify the harbors of Cuba and Puerto Rico better with modern Spanish-type Ordóñez rifle guns. I know there were very few in Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from. I think that there were maybe two in La Habana. Guantanamo Bay was not fortified at all. So that is one question. The second question is, given that presumably the Spanish also knew that their main opponent would be the U.S., how come was it that Cervera took so long to cross the Atlantic? We know he stopped at the Azores, then stopped at Martinique, then he went to Curacao, finally went to bottleneck in Santiago, and was all over. So, sabiendo los españoles, yo presumo que no estaban pensando en invadir Nueva York y tenían toda esa información sobre la preparación de los Estados Unidos. ¿Cómo usted nos explica que no hayan tomado medidas para hacer mejor preparaciones de artillería, coastal artillery, en puertos importantes como La Habana, San Juan, Ponce, Matanzas, Guantánamo? Esa es la primera pregunta. Y la segunda, ¿cómo usted explica la tardanza de la flota de Cervera en llegar desde España hasta Cuba, que tomó muchísimo tiempo, estuvo en las Azores, no sé si estuvo en Canarias, después en las Islas Francesas, en Martinica, en Curazao, hasta que finalmente llegó en Santiago. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Regarding the very first one, the artillery coastal in all the Caribbean positions was a major concern for the Spanish authorities during the whole second part of the 19th century. In fact, after the visit of the Rear Admiral Godon to the island, there was a lot of reunions in Madrid. The board of ammunitions, I think the board of artillery in Madrid make a lot of reunions and prepared a lot of reports regarding the absence of rifled and a good artillery in the Caribbean. And it was alleged that all the modern artillery was used to defend the Spanish ports and not sent to Cuba, and it was only sent the old pieces there, and it was a public concern at that time, and I don't know why they didn't reinforce it. And about the second question, I really have no idea. There was no real I have no idea why exactly the fleet didn't arrive early to Cuba. It was a time of difficult to make difficult decisions for the Spanish government, and it was a huge of unpreparedness. The fleet was not ready. Some of the vessels, and it was the case of the Cristobal Colón, did not mount their bigger artillery pieces. I think it was all improvised, and at the end they did not really took advantage of the reports were sent by the Spanish attaches in Washington. In fact, all the system of acquiring military information from abroad became restructured after the Spanish American War, because they were aware they had useful information that did not make a huge contribution to the development of the conflict.
Thank you.
In the back, sir.
Yeah. A comment on what Pedro just said. You know, it should make us all think about jumping to conclusions about intelligence failures. It doesn't sound like an intelligence failure to me. It's like a failure in planning and a failure in logistical planning in particular. So my questions are for Mr. Kinnaman and Andrew. For Mr. Kinnaman, simply, you know, did Lenthal ever considering for publishing his ideas to a much broader audience? Great. For Andrew, because we all know he who publishes is the guy that gets the credit for the idea, even if it isn't his idea, right? So then going to Andrew, Andrew, could you explain more to some of us who are novices with this? I know the effort here is to save money and to save ammo. Why the Morse tubes and the Dodder's guns, you know, are so effective in improving the target practice of the fleet? So, and again, whatever order Mr. Kinnaman and Andrew want to
I
answer.
think we'll bring Stephen in first.
Yeah.
Okay.
If you could, well, go ahead. Can you bring up my my PowerPoint again? And there's a page
Let's do
near
that.
the end.
Okay, the question was, did Lenthal publish any of his thinking or thoughts about naval strategy? Is that correct?
Or did you consider even publishing it for a broader audience?
The answer I can give you is that from everything I've seen, he did not. He was not the sort of person. He was a very reticent, cerebral engineer, and was not a one to publish. I've not seen, from all the evidence I've been through the Ives collection at the Naval Academy and through Lenthal's papers at the Independence Seaport Museum and the Franklin Institute. I've never seen any evidence that he published much of anything. The one thing he did publish was around condemnation of Alban Stimmers over the light draft monitor fiasco, and that was in an op-ed piece in a Boston newspaper. But to answer your question, Lenthal didn't publish these theories or this strategy, and he published very little else.
Thank you.
Okay, so if we can get the picture of the daughter up there.
Did I pronounce it correctly, Andrew?
What's that?
Daughter?
Daughter, yeah, that's what it is. It makes dots on a piece of paper. That's the ingenious, go back. So what it does is there we go. So this is a framework here, and it has heavy duty paper on it, and it would have a little ship image on it that would be the same sight image you would get looking through the telescope. Now this is from a British manual. There's a telescopic sight there, and here are the gun pointers control here, the gun aimer on the other side. So this this is all done, in port,
It's a simulation.
What's that?
It's a simulation.
Exactly, it's a simulation. So that's the beauty of it. It didn't cost any money or hardly any money. And so frame would be set up, and so the guy would be cranking it, and it would imitate the motion of a ship at sea. The gunner would be looking through the telescope, and then he would follow that target, with the telescopic sight. So the gun is moving up and down, following the target. He presses the firing button, and that actually it's electric solenoid that makes a little pencil, which is in line with the barrel, shoot out and make a little pencil dot on a piece of paper.
Wow, okay.
And so that way there, they would get so when you read works like by Philip Alger and other people about this, there's this firing. I forget the exact term he used, but it's this time frame between when you press it, you're getting the sight picture in your brain, and you're pressing the target, the button, and the shell is going out of the gun. There's this lag there, so you're trying to get these gunners trained to anticipate that. So they make the little target, they make the little hit on this moving target frame. The Morris tube was an improvement on that. It actually used the Morris tube originally was used for British indoor rifle target practice, where they would put a tube inside of a Lee Metford service rifle that would be chambered for .22 caliber, and it would have the charge in there may only be the primer charge. It was basically, if I talk about where the word ping pong comes from in terms of what Sims uses, I'll talk about that later. But the idea was you take the same kind of little load you'd use in a target gallery, and that would then make a nice hole in the target. It was just felt to be better than the daughter itself. And so that was one of the innovations that Sims brought back from the China station. He had seen Percy Scott use this, and they in Robley Evans.
Fighting Bob.
Fighting Bob talks about this. He doesn't give Sim very much credit. He gives all the credit to Ridley McLean for coming up with this idea. They actually went out and bought these little target rifles and bought thousands of rounds of this gallery ammunition, and they were using it extensively in the China station, and it greatly improved their scores. That's one of the big innovations that Sims brings back and spreads into the fleet in early 1903. So the whole idea was that we don't have enough money to spend on gunnery. We need to make it cheap. That was the remit that Niblack was given. You don't have any money. You got to figure out some way to make target practice work without actually firing guns.
Great. Other questions from the floor? And let's double check that we don't have any questions in the Q&A function online. I don't want to leave our online participants out.
No questions, sir.
No questions. Going once, going twice. Well, with that, thank you very much to all three of our presenters.
Thank you, Chris.
Well, it's make perfect sense that if the British are going to make it the same way.